Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'm very pleased today to warmly welcome Marcia Dawson. We're going to chat a little bit today about Indigenous leadership, both from a historical context and a contemporary. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the circle and allowing us to sit in conversation today. So as a quick reminder to everyone participating, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If you know that's you today, I would recommend please for you to engage with an elder, a friend, counselor, family member, whatever it is that works for you. Please engage in that support system. So introductions, my name is Cole, I'm from the Tsawwassen First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the session today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera are Cynthia today, just our production coordinator. So I think that's what I would like to say for the opening 30 seconds, and I'd like to turn the mic over to you.
Sure, I'll just speak my language, Cole, if that's okay.
Please.
I'm a hifuk, sim giget, sigaram hanak, gan gabulsuk, na melwe, lach gabu, will paisum suan suetwik. Angie Turner, Welsh Nachit, Magnus Turner, Welsh Nagwadi. Nugwa Marcia Dawson, Gaich and Lach Gwai. What I said to you in my language is that my name is Marcia Dawson. I am Lachgabu, so I'm Gitxsan from northwestern BC. I am Lachgabu, which means I'm from the Wolf Clan, and I'm Wilpaisums, which means I'm from House of Chief Haisums. And I also acknowledged you in my Kwakwaka'wakw language to acknowledge my connection to the Kwakwaka'wakw community of Kinkaminlet through my Dawson family.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we are on Musqueam territory as well, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's definitely an honor.
Yeah, I'm very excited. So launching right into it, as we discussed a little bit previously online, I think what's best is we can start in from a historical standpoint. So from your perspective, from your community's standpoint, I suppose, what did Indigenous leadership look like in the past in terms of, let's start with family roles within the clan system?
Sure. So Cole, in historical times, leadership was really egalitarian in terms of how we were structured and how we existed as a people. And so what that means is leadership is really about being in service to our families. It was not hierarchical. It was really about the equality of men and women in leadership roles. And equality didn't mean sameness in historical times. It meant that they were both important, but there were distinct roles, for men and distinct roles for women. And this shows up in the Kwakwaka'wakw context in terms of the governance structure that is the traditional governance structure of Kwakwaka'wakw people. And so I want to acknowledge that the knowledge that I share here today, Cole, really comes from my lived experiences over time and meeting with elders and meeting with chiefs, and also more recently in spending time with the Ninoxala in my Kwakwaka'wakw family. Specifically, I spent time with elders Vera Newman, Pauline Alfred, Alberta Billy, and Charlotte Joseph, and chiefs Randy Cook and Cody and Edwin Newman and White Lady Speck. And the reason why I acknowledge them is because a lot of what I will share with you today with regard to the Kwakwaka'wakw side of the knowledge I share really comes from them. It's my learning from the Ninoxala that I spent time with. So leadership in a historical context, in a Kwakwaka'wakw context, is embedded in the structure of their governance system, which is the Nanima system of governance for Kwakwaka'wakw people. And what that looks like is the role of a chief in the Kwakwaka'wakw system, as well as the matriarch. And, as I spent time with the Ninoxala, they shared with me how that system was in place through the tradition of passing on that leadership role through the eldest of the eldest of the eldest. And so it was preserved through the way in which they passed on those leadership roles within their system of Namima, system of governance.
So just quickly, when you say the eldest of the eldest, to provide like an example for me, right?
Sure.
Does that mean the next eldest person in the community, or within a specific family line?
Within the specific family. So the Namima, the word Namima refers to the family structures of the Kwakwaka'wakw. So they were organized according to family units.
Okay.
And so it would be the eldest of the family, and then their eldest child would inherit the chieftainship or the matriarchal role.
Mm-hmm.
And then the eldest of that would inherit it. So it was passed down from the eldest to the eldest to the eldest. So for example, if you were the eldest, then your eldest son would inherit the chieftainship.
Mm-hmm.
And then your son's eldest son would inherit the chieftainship. And your eldest daughter would inherit the matriarchal role. And so on and so on. So that's how it was inherited in terms of that structure. And so I think an important teaching that I had learned from that was the importance of balance, the importance of both men and women. In the Kwakwaka'wakw, the leadership roles in Kwakwaka'wakw systems of governance involved both men and women. You saw that with the role of the chief and the matriarch. You also saw that through the roles of the Hamatsa and the Hiligiste. And so Hamatsa is high-ranking, much like the chief, and is groomed to be next in line for chieftainship, typically, within the families. And the Hiligiste is the female role that will provide the training and guidance of the Hamatsa. So you'll always see the way balance is demonstrated in the structure of the Namima system, having both men and women. And so leadership for, in the historical context involved both men and women. It was not one or the other or hierarchical. It required both.
Mm-hmm.
And in a Gitxsan context, similarly, that was how it existed for us too. We are a matriarchal society. And so what that looked like for us was we do have a chief in our clan systems. For example, I mentioned that I was Lachibu, and then also I mentioned I was from Wilpaisum. So Wilp is our word for house groups, and so those are family units. And so in my house group, we have a chief who's the head of our house. We refer to our chief as Simagat. So we have a Simagat and we have a Siginam Hanak. Siginam Hanak is our female chief. She is our matriarch. And so again, you'll see within our governance structure, leadership is structured around the importance of both men and women. So you'll see the importance of balance demonstrated in the ancestral system of governance for our people.
Just if we so for those people that may be a little bit kind of brand new to this, when we say matriarchal and patriarchal, these are different, I guess, systems, I suppose, that are based primarily on the gender of what is referred to as the leader. So like typically in Western European societies have often been patriarchal in the sense that you think of like a king, and a king is typically can only be male, and then that succession can only be succeeded through the male. So when you say that our societies are matriarchal, it just kind of flips that. Is that right?
Sure. And in an Indigenous context, for example, in my Kwakwaka'wakw side of the family, they are a patriarchal society. And so it really is linked into our identity and our rights and so how that flows through in terms of what we inherit. So for example, my sons, they inherit their rights to their songs and dances and ceremony and resources and land and territory through their father's side.
Right, as opposed to their mother's side.
Exactly. So on my side, it's matriarchal. so they inherit, their rights to our land and territory through their mother. So they are born into the Lachgebu, the wolf clan. They're born into the Wilpaisums on my side of the family. Yeah, two distinct systems.
Cool. Very cool. I love that that piece about balance as well, though. Even though we talk about like societies or systems being matriarchal or patriarchal, there's still that inherent gender balance that's found in Indigenous leadership models, which is missing in some other kind of worldviews.
Exactly. And I think too, it really is about distinct worldviews, I think, in terms of how we understand the roles of leadership in an Indigenous context. For example, when I look at the roles of women, in a Western lens, the roles of women historically were that they stayed home and raised children. But when you look at it from an Indigenous lens, our women did stay home and raise children, but that was for the important responsibility of cultural continuity. So it wasn't primarily just motherhood. It was really, and I don't say just motherhood, it was motherhood and more. It was because the transmission of knowledge and language happened in the home. The way in which we learned, the way in which we passed on the knowledge of our cultural practices happened in the home at the feet of our grandmothers and, with our parents around the kitchen table and with our grandparents. And so women led that largely historically for our families because of the different gender roles. We saw, men were out on the land, and women were home taking care of the home and the community. And so that really is a key distinction in terms of the different worldviews, in terms of how we see leadership and what that means to us as Indigenous people.
It almost comes down to like a fundamental difference in the way that you value it. It's not even necessarily the roles were all that different or they're not worlds apart, but it's just a fundamental reflection of the way that the community around those roles valued that part to play.
Exactly. And for Indigenous people, that was inherent in their way of life, right? In terms of how they valued those roles. So, for example, women were highly revered, in terms of their roles in families and communities. Women were understood to be the life givers and important for the future of the tribe, for the sustainability of the tribe. And so for that reason, women were held sacred and respected. And so there was high value placed on the importance of women. And so you see that demonstrated in a variety of different ways in terms of the way in which we lived as Indigenous people historically. And you see that embedded in ceremony and song as well, too. So particularly, in what I learned from the Ninoxala when I spent time with the Kwakwaka'wakw elders and chiefs to hear about the roles of women in Kwakwaka'wakw governance and leadership, and how they shared with me the importance of women in the Kwakwaka'wakw context in terms of the work that they did to pass on the knowledge and language to their children. And women had a significant role in not only caring for the children, but to implement a various ceremony, such as the coming of age ceremony. So a lot of it was very intentional in terms of how they passed on that knowledge through ceremony. I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. And as well, I think too, the important distinct roles of women with regard to medicines, traditional medicines. And so, looking at our unique gifts as women, not only as life givers, but as knowledge holders, women in the Kwakwaka'wakw cultures recorded the knowledge, for the feasts and for the potlatches and, from various elders in the community. And so they really spent a lot of time recording the business of the nation, of the family, and documenting that in various ways. And so that was their role. And so that role afforded them that place in the seat of governance for the Kwakwaka'wakw people, where they worked alongside of the chiefs to provide that knowledge to the chiefs. So that again goes back to the notion of balance and the requirement for both men and women in leadership for Kwakwaka'wakw families.
So how does that translate, or in your experience, how does that translate? We talked about kind of chief versus the matriarch, not in a versus, but in a complementary fashion, right? So then we're talking a little bit about women kind of in community or in the everyday context being kind of these really just like fountains of knowledge, right? Hold and store the community knowledge. How does that translate to the matriarch in the sense that is the matriarch, traditionally speaking, would the matriarch just kind of, but like hold try and hold the collective knowledge of the women in community to represent that in council and in partnership with the chief? Is kind of that how it worked? Or
Well, the way in the Kwakwaka'wakw context, the role of the matriarch was specific to their families, right? So
Okay.
each Namima will have their own chief, and each Namima will
Right.
have their own matriarch.
okay.
And so their responsibility would be to their specific Namima, to their specific families.
Right.
And similarly in the Gitxsan context as well too. So for example, in my family, I do have a chief, and my sister is the eldest, who is our matriarch. And so her role is specific to our Wilp Haizums.
Mm-hmm.
And so the role of the matriarch is very distinct to the families in those two contexts. It would be different for other Indigenous cultures and people and nations across the province. And so I just want to be clear that I'm just speaking within the context of those two nations that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
When families were to come together to try to make more collective decisions, how would that work, I suppose? If families have recognized leaders, how do those leaders, would they have all come together collaboratively to make larger scale decisions? Like, I guess one good example might be kind of tending to the land and maybe solving disputes between families as to who had resource gathering what time of year or something like that. How would those decisions have been made?
Well, ultimately, the chiefs had the role as speakers for the family. They spoke on behalf of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had a responsibility to meet with members of the family, to meet with the matriarchs, and to have those conversations together. And it would vary, I think, within each of the families in terms of how and when they would have those conversations. But it would definitely be something that would be a practice in terms of having that collective conversation together within their own family first, and then the spokesperson would be the chief, who would speak to the issue, if it was an issue within the Wilp for the Gitxsan in the Gitxsan context, or within the clan, and then so the chiefs would be the speakers on behalf of the family. That answers your question. I think that there are different mechanisms for dispute resolution. I think you raised the whole idea of what if there's a dispute, and I think that for the most part, the way in which we communicated and existed, was really from a place of Indigenous value systems, of unity. And so we really tried hard to support processes that promoted unity. And I think that for that reason, there was a lot of respect afforded to each other. You'll see that embedded in our protocols, right, in terms of our recognition of the land and territory that we arrived to, like the territory here in Musqueam. You'll see that embedded in the way in which we respect the roles of the matriarchs in relation to the roles of the chiefs. So I think that for the most part, the disunity was fairly minimal, I think, historically, because of the way in which we embodied ancestral values of unity and respect and integrity and love and care. And so, and that was interrupted, over time through colonization. And so we see a disconnect from some of those values within our communities and within our family systems.
And I think that's kind of a larger issue, right? Is that we're kind of trying to. Every community is different, and I think every community is on a different place in their journey of reconciliation and reconciliation with the contemporary world, I suppose, and also with themselves, their ancestors, and their own knowledge bases and community values. My next question is kind of, I'm glad that you brought it up, because my next question is kind of leading more into that contemporary context. And how do you see, because obviously a lot of our current leadership structures in community are a little bit different with elected chief and council.
Yes.
How do you see that as what is your opinion of that system? And then a follow-up question, is there a way that we can somehow move back towards more traditional values? Like, I'm not sure, but maybe even having mandated gender roles specifically, or mandating a certain balance within chief and council. I know that some communities are vastly thrown out of balance just based on the individuals within the community that are more invested or more active, right? Particularly, I think, in the contemporary context, when we move into fields of things like health, things that I'm really involved with, massive amount of women, which is unbelievable, and it's so great that they move forward and they take this work up in a good way, right? And I mean, this is no disrespect, but as a man in that field, it can feel quite isolating, particularly as an Indigenous man in this field, as there aren't as many. So, sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there, but I guess
That's totally
my
fine.
point is, like, what are your thoughts of the chief and council system in terms of voting? And then do you think there's value in trying to reconnect with some of those more traditional thoughts?
That's the work that I've been doing over the last few years in terms of my consulting business. I think a lot of what we recognize as communities is that we're trying to come out of the Indian Act. And so the system of governance that was imposed on our communities from the Indian Act resulted in a governance system referred to as the chief and council system that you mentioned. And that's not conducive to our communities. It doesn't fit with our value system. It's a Western construct that has marginalized our traditional governance system, and so it's completely opposite of the system that we just spoke about, at the beginning of this session. And so we see a real shift in terms of how leadership unfolds through the chief council system that's doesn't fit with our value systems. And so how do we reconcile that as communities? Well, that's the complexity of what's happened to our people, in our history, because now we see the polarity of the two systems that exist in our communities. We have both chief and council systems, and we see the resurgence of our traditional systems, where we're trying to bring back the hereditary systems and the traditional systems that was the strength of our people. That was the work that I did recently when I had decided to do my master's degree, which I just completed this February. And
congratulations.
So, thank you. A lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And so when I was working with the University of Victoria, they invited me to develop a diploma program. And so the diploma in Indigenous community development and governance, so really looking at building capacity in community in terms of governance. And so what I recognized was there was not enough resources that were reflective of our ways of governing, from a traditional context. And so I became passionate about exploring in my language, which means strength of a woman in the Gitxsan language, in our Samalgach language. And so translates to strength of a woman. And the context with which we say that is the powerfulness of the matriarch in the Gitxsan feast system. And so I wanted to explore what that looked like in a governance context so that I could begin to incorporate that kind of knowledge into our curricula. Because currently, right now, many post-secondary institutions, although we see more and more really indigenizing and decolonizing curricula, many post-secondary institutions teach Western governance systems and constructs, and not specific to ours here in BC. What I ended up doing was I ended up looking at the roles of Kwakwaka'wakw women in leadership and governance. So I kind of shifted over to my Dawson side of the family, primarily because of my location on Vancouver Island, and so that was where I named the Namima at the beginning of the session, where I spent time with them to learn what were those roles.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's my long way of answering your question in terms of what my thoughts are around the chief and council system. And essentially, we're trying really hard to bring back the strength of the ancestral system. That was the strength of our people, and that was the focus of my thesis research. And so I narrowed my research down to the roles of women, so that I could finish my thesis.
So it was feasible, yeah.
So I wouldn't do a PhD.
Mhm.
And because governance is huge and broad and nebulous. And so, you had to narrow it down in order to do this work. And so when I did look at the role of women in Kwakwaka'wakw cultures, how I approached that was through examining the knowledge embedded in ceremony. And so, because I strongly believe that the ancestors put in a system in place that was the strength of our people. And one way in which we can see that is through the songs and ceremonies that we share in the governance halls of Kwakwaka'wakw people, which is the potlatch, right? And so you see where we solidify a lot of those systems through various ceremonies. And so I examined 4 ceremonies as part of my knowledge gathering with the Ninoxala that I spent time with. So I learned about the role of the Hamatsa and the Hiligiste. I learned about the morning songs and the role of women within that morning song ceremony. And I learned about the tuchweed, which is one of the ceremonies that the women have in the potlatch. And I learned about, what's the 4th ceremony that I looked at? So essentially what I looked at was how embedded within our teachings and our ceremonies is the teaching of balance, the teaching of both men and women, and the teaching that is the strength of our people. And so with that, I completed my knowledge gathering with the Ninoxala, and I took that and started incorporating that into curricula at North Island College in the courses that I taught there in governance and leadership, as well as the University of Victoria in the course that I taught there in terms of strategic planning. And now I've been invited to Royal Roads University to teach their leadership course there. So I'll be incorporating Indigenous concepts of leadership into those courses. So you can see that we're shifting away from sort of those colonial constructs of leadership and governance. And
just a celebrity.
I don't know, but I feel like I don't want to criticize. I mean, obviously the chief and council system is not conducive to our people. It holds colonialism in place. The structure in and of itself holds it in place.
Yeah.
And we're trying to come out of that. And we're doing that in varying ways in community. And the efforts look different across the province, right? And so for me, my effort is at the systems level in terms of trying to provide relevant training at post-secondary institutions. And finding ways to shift the way in which we understand governance in an Indigenous context and leadership in an Indigenous context in education. And I think also too, I wanted to touch on some of the work that I've been doing with my Gitxsan communities. And it's along the lines of privileging Indigenous knowledge systems, and that's a real important aspect of our leadership roles as Indigenous people. Is finding ways not only to come out of the Indian Act, but how do we facilitate the resurgence of our teachings in the work that we do, and how do we embed that into the system? And so I've been working with 3 Gitxsan communities in my nation, Gitxsan and Kwakwaka'wakw and Gitxsan. And so they invited me to support the development of a strategic plan for mental health for the 3 communities. And so in our journey to do that together, what I recognized when we gathered in the room was that everyone was speaking our Simalgach language. And so I said, don't speak English just because I'm here. And please speak in our language, because what I recognize that is embedded in our language are concepts that is the strength of our people. And that we can't express in English, in the English language. And so we journeyed through 2 days of strategic planning, and we landed with concepts that are meaningful to us in terms of Gitxsan people, in terms of mental well-being, and Gitxsan concepts of care. And so it's really about the resurgence of our teachings, the resurgence of our culture, and really taking a leadership role in terms of how we do that in our communities. And, where we landed with that work too as well was we shifted away from Western constructs of mental health and embracing Gitxsan concepts of well-being. So just, and how we did that too within that work was my job was to write the plan. And then I worked with my group where they worked with a group of knowledge holders where they translated those my plan into our language. Beautiful. So again, really embracing our ways and shifting away from colonial constructs and systems and journeying to our culture.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and I think it's a purposeful side effect of colonialism, and it's a shame that so often we as Indigenous people, even if we're doing our own thing and we're investing in our own communities and we're having that dialogue, we still occasionally look back to the contemporary colonial structures in place for validation. I'm thinking like, healthcare plans that need to go through external public health organizations, or these organizations that need to go back to post-secondary academic institutions for that little check of validity. We don't need that. You know what I mean? And I think that's what's beautiful about the project you're talking about, right?
Exactly. And that's, that's the work that I've been really doing in terms of my work with like Royal Roads University. My conversations with the universities that I work with is really not validating our knowledge systems with Western knowledge systems, just recognizing they're two distinct knowledge systems. And I think that with this work too, there's something that you said that I was going to comment about it. It escaped my mind. I wanted to talk about, you touched on the colonial systems, right? The governance, chief and council system, and how I talked about how that holds, that structurally in place in our communities. And I think that we do have challenges, in terms of our leadership as a result of, our history with regard to the imposition of the colonial system in our communities. But, the work that I do is really to try to look less at that and look more at the strength of our system as Indigenous people. We have tremendous strength in terms of our teachings and our values and our practices. And how can we incorporate that into contemporary organizational systems and processes, right? And so taking what we learned from our ancestors and applying that to various organizations and various policies and various systems to shift the way in which we do work in our organizations, to shift the way in which we relate to each other in our organizations, and the way we relate to our community members as well too. Because you'll see some of the challenges include the toxicity that we see in some of the families as a result of our colonial history, the impacts of colonization on our families. We see challenges in terms of lateral violence in some of our organizations, and these are not unique to Indigenous communities. They exist across the board, with various organizations, but I think somewhat magnified for our communities because of the size of our communities and the size of our organizations, right? But, and so the way forward, I believe, is to really look at some of our values and principles and apply those to our organizational processes. As a way of shifting the way in which we work together. And that requires leadership competencies that are embedded in our ancestral teachings.
I think one thing I wanted to touch on, and then I have a follow-up question. One of the things I wanted to touch on there that you spoke about, and just kind of a reflection, is that as we each, and I say each singularly as communities, let's say across the province or even across the nation, across this land, as we look to move into embracing our traditional values and trying to move away from these colonial systems of governance that are put in place, I think that first step takes strong leadership from these positions that are already elected, right? As an example, it can be difficult to engage and facilitate with a community on a systems governance level if those elected elected chief and council aren't on board with that change. Would you agree or disagree?
It's definitely complex, and I think it's. I agree, and it's also multifaceted too. And I don't think it's black and white. And I think that it's going to take us time, to come out of where we're at. And I think we're headed in that direction. I'm always positive that we're doing good things, and I think that there's not always visibility to the good things that we're doing, but in the work that I'm doing with communities and agencies, I find that I'm always really impressed with the kinds of work that's being undertaken on the ground in various agencies. I've worked with a friendship center in Duncan. My colleague there is a tremendous leader, and I observe her and watch her, and I just think how she's so highly respected in the work that she does for the friendship center. Deb Williams, and she's just fabulous. And when I facilitate the work that I do, the feel that I get in the organization is just full of warmth and respect and unity, all of the things that we believe in. So I feel like it's possible that we can come out of where we're at.
Yeah.
I'm always hopeful. When I was preparing for today too, when I was thinking about what are those competencies that we need to incorporate into our organizational systems, what does that look like? And so I reflect on, what I heard from my elders and my chiefs and my parents and grandparents and the Ninoxala that I spent time with, and one thing that I recognize that where we need to land as leaders is that we truly need to be authentic, right? And I think authenticity speaks to the way in which we are truly grounded in our ancestral teachings, in our values, in our principles, in our practices, and so we need to spend time to learn about what those really are, given our history in terms of how we've been impacted by colonialism. And so, authenticity also speaks to the need to delve into that deep work that we need to do as leaders in terms of our healing, in terms of who we are. Everyone's been impacted by colonization, every single one of us. And so there needs to be varying degrees of healing that need to happen in our community and among our leaders. And so, and the reason why I say that is because when you take a look at how we've been impacted and how we need to journey through our healing, where we land with that is recognizing what our ancestral teachings were meant to be for us as Gitxsan, as Kwakwaka'wakw, and so I think the more we move through the healing journey, the more we discover what our ancestors intended us for to be. So the authenticity is really important in terms of a leadership competency for our communities.
Yeah. So I'm taking a moment to just kind of process and reflect. I think that a lot of that is just like you said, it's multi-layered, it's complex, it's difficult because on top of all of this conversation of systems of governance, you have individual competencies that kind of need to be in place in order to enact these systems, right? And vice versa. They're complementary. They can't exist without the other, right? Exactly. A system without strong leadership, without good leadership, from an individual standpoint, even if it's a fantastic system, it might not work, just, based on the reality of kind of the difficult work that lies ahead for a lot of communities and for a lot of us. It's fantastic work in the sense that I think we're all moving, I agree, and I think we're all moving forward in a good way. But those first steps are going to be tough. They're going to be difficult.
Exactly.
So we need to have those supports in place. And that kind of a little bit leads into my next question, which was, what would your advice be to kind of community leaders or those looking to begin this process, to begin this journey in their own communities, of looking at kind of gathering the information on what their traditional systems of governance look like and how they can take the first steps towards implementing those?
I knew you were going to ask me that question.
Look at that, you're so prepared.
Well, I was thinking about that, in terms of my own journey. I can only, speak to sort of what came out of my journey in terms of looking at governance and leadership and how we move forward. And I think that communities can do this, in varying ways, depending on, I guess, where their knowledge an understanding of their own cultural teachings is that, like, because we have some communities who are strong in their culture, and some communities have lost their culture. So it would be really dependent on where they're at, I think. But for the most part, I think, really taking the time to look at the knowledge, carried by our elders is really critical. We, spending time with those who are the knowledge holders, spending time with people who are wise in terms of how much they know. And I think that for me, when I spent time with the Ninaxala, when I was learning from them with my thesis journey, I felt like there was so much more that I could learn in the small amount of time that I spent with them. And it got me really excited about learning more about our language, because our knowledge is embedded in our language, right? And and our knowledge is connected to the land, and our knowledge, is ancient knowledge. And I feel like we have to really start intentionally looking at those pieces if we're going to move forward with the work that we're going to do to come out of the Indian Act to develop those competencies that are reflective of our ancestral teachings, right? And I think that we really need to look at the practice that our ancestors had in terms of that intentionality. When I was sitting with the Ninaxal, I had heard from them how the women intentionally taught the language and culture to the children, right? And it was a responsibility, and it was an obligation, and so now we see various acts of resurgence happening in our communities, where we're trying to see the revitalization of our language and our cultural practices, but I feel like we need to be very intentional in how we do that. And the reason why I say that too is because I had recently traveled to New Zealand. I went to spend time with some Maori friends, and I was in their home, and the Maori couple that I spent time with were second language learners, and so they hadn't been raised with their Maori language, and so what they did was they spent time immersing themselves in learning the language as adult learners. And then what they committed to was to speak only Maori to their children. And so they have 3 sons who are first language learners. So Maori is their first language. And so there you see the intentionality that they had undertaken to really commit to those processes that bring back what our ancestors put in place. I think that's what needs to happen for our communities, is that intentionality and commitment for the resurgence of our language and our practices and leadership values.
If communities root themselves in their culture and stay strong in that and listen to their elders, and the systems will rise.
Exactly.
Great. Beautiful. So, the next, do you have something? I see you reading notes. I just wanted to make sure that I was giving you a chance to say anything you wanted to say.
No, just thinking about, just to build on your question to me where you asked what communities need to do. And I reflect on spending time with Chief Ed Newman. He's an elder and chief in the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation who I had spent time with. And he's 94 years old, and he's seen so much change over time, and as I listened to him, he talked about how we need to lift each other up. We need to lift each other up, and that language, that old school language that he uses is reflective of that value and teaching that we need to return to as a people. And I think that, he talked about that within the context of his family. That's my role as a chief, is to lift up my family. And Makwala, Chief Randy Cook, said the same thing to me when I spent time with him as well too. Is my role is to lift up my family in the potlatch, and in everyday life, and I teach that to my daughter and my son. Makwala said to me, as I think about that, that speaks to the importance of really looking at our gifts as people, and finding ways to be forward thinking, finding ways to work with our families in a way that there's a strong sense of identity, strong sense of belonging, and strong sense of purpose and community. And I think that that just speaks to the strength, again, of the system that our ancestors put in place. And I think that, you know, the opposite of that speaks to the fragmentation of our families, which is the point that I wanted to make around unity. Linked to lifting each other up is the importance of unity as a people, unity as family, and we've the unity has been disrupted in our families and community as a result of our history. And so, you know, when I listen to Chief Newman and I listen to the Ninoch, all of the elders, a lot of them talked about how we truly need to be united in what we do. And that requires healing, that requires conversation, that requires authenticity, that requires intentionality in order to achieve the ability to be united as families, united as communities. And I think that when I think about, you know, the opposite of those conversations, the opposite is fragmentation. And so I can see why our ancestors felt the importance of those concepts in terms of our teachings, in terms of lifting each other up. That's such a beautiful principle to live by. You know, it speaks of love, it speaks of respect, it speaks of care, concern. It speaks about really holding each other close, right? And I think that was the strength of our teachings.
And I think that's kind of the beautiful implicit knowledge of a teaching that simple, is that you can revisit it many, many times as a beginner, or as a, you know, when you're first starting on your journey of leading, whether or not that whatever context it is. And then when you've done it for 40 or 50 years, these simple teachings take on new meanings as you gain new experiences. And I think that that's beautiful and complex in its own way. So we're just going to take a few questions from our online audience now, as long as that works for you.
Sure.
We've been kind of chatting up a storm here. So Margaret asks, I think kind of referring back to when we were talking about matriarchs and chiefs, what are the qualities that you believe of a strong woman leader, and how does that contrast with a strong man leader in these systems?
I think with our women, I think a lot of the strength that comes from a women comes from the roles that they had historically in terms of that cultural continuity piece that I was talking about. And I think that the knowledge that our women had, you know, in the historical context was being familiar with all of the history, the governance, the land, the resources, the ceremony, the songs. And so if you want to apply that to a contemporary context, you know, it speaks to how what that translates to in terms of competencies for our women is really the ability to be forward thinking and critical thinking and strategic thinking. And I think for, you know, for men, I think that it's really not too different. I think we see the same within men, but historically the distinct roles of men and women were in terms of their positions as chiefs and matriarchs, right? And I think for chiefs, they were their leadership, you know, what I heard from like Makula and Kiodi and Wedlidi and Edwin, consistently they echoed that it is my job to listen to my family. And so that was a key distinction that I heard between the two. When I heard about the role of the chiefs, it was my job was to speak on behalf of the family, to listen to the family, to be in service to my family. Whereas what I heard as in terms of the role of the matriarchs was they were responsible for cultural continuity. They were responsible for the language transmission of knowledge. You know, so really distinct roles in that sense. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's sort of my thoughts around that.
Awesome. Thanks very much for the question, Margaret. And if that doesn't address your question, you can just type away again. So we have another question from Chaz. I apologize if I mispronounced the name. What are some of the challenges in bringing back the ancestral ways of governance and leadership, I think broadly, especially within particular systems like government or education? Or what do you see as the biggest kind of challenges that we face?
Well, I think in community, I think broadly in community, I think the challenge is that we've lost a lot of our cultural teachings. So we're really just trying to relearn what those are, and understanding how to apply ancestral value systems and knowledge systems to contemporary contexts, because the issues that we face in contemporary society today are different from ancient times, right? Yeah. And so we have the complexity of applying those to contemporary issues. However, I do believe in the strength of our knowledge systems. A lot of what I reference, in the work that I do is that when we talk about the roles of women and the roles of men and our ceremony, those are actually our laws. Mm-hmm. And so how do we apply those laws organizationally? And so that's the complexity of the work that we need to do, is how do we unpack that so that we're not changing those cultural teachings mm-hmm. to fit the contemporary circumstances that we're trying to address. Mm-hmm. So it will require a lot of conversation, with our elders. It will require conversations with our knowledge holders. And that's the work that I did with the Gitxsan folks when we were taking a look at that mental health plan and shifting our language around that piece. And where we landed with a lot of that conversation was that we really had to hold true to our concepts mm-hmm. and not change them. And that's difficult. That's difficult to do because we're addressing complex issues in society today. Broadly speaking, within institutions, it's really... the list is so big. When I look at post-secondary, for example, right? Yeah. It's having to bump up against the colonial value systems in a way that we constantly have to prove the validity of our knowledge, right? There's this experience where we're always having to demonstrate to the wider society that our knowledge system is valid, and so similarly in post-secondary institutions where, when we're developing curricula, if it doesn't look like a Western construct, then it must not be valid, right? And so mm-hmm. that's a real challenge in terms of teaching and indigenizing and decolonizing educational systems. And but I think it's possible. We're seeing growing movement around those pieces. We see some of the changes and more openness for that. But we're not there yet, right? I mean, that's why you see we're pushing for change. You see work by various groups and communities around how do we implement the calls to action for reconciliation. That's why you see the BC government, you see a lot of our leaders who have just recently worked to incorporate the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into legislation, yep. into law here in BC. Yep. And so those are tools that we try to use to help support our rights as Indigenous people. To try and shift the system and to try to shift the change that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's very complex. It's not black and white, but I think that the more we try to find ways to do this, we take that step forward. Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
Awesome. One thought struck me while you were chatting there as well, is I think when we speak about bringing this knowledge back into community and we talk about implementing it, we talk about rediscovering it, I think another key piece has to be that knowledge has to then be gifted back to the whole community. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think that in not a lot of, but in some communities that doesn't necessarily happen. Yeah. And we end up with pockets within the community or pockets within leadership that are really traditionally rooted, mm-hmm. but that for some reason or another doesn't disseminate out to the rest of the community. And I think that is a critical step in making sure that everyone, or that everyone understands what those traditional systems are and the value that they bring. Do you know what I mean? Because once you have the actual community, the people, once you have everyone buying into that and everyone mm-hmm. acknowledging that the place that traditional system should have, mm-hmm. I think that makes the transition a lot easier. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Whereas if there's some members of the community that maybe haven't been gifted the opportunity to to experience that knowledge firsthand, then that transition can be more difficult.
I think so too, and I think that I mean, there's so many things that have come to mind when I hear you talk about that, and I think that we do have varied capacities in our families and communities in terms of our understanding of our culture. Myself, if I can speak about myself, I'm the youngest of 8 children. I'm the youngest of 8, I don't speak my language fluently. I'm learning. I understand my language, but I'm learning. And so, we've been impacted in varying degrees as a result of our experiences and our history. And so that in and of itself makes it very complex in terms of how we return to our system. I often use the example of my sister Arlene. She speaks our language fluently, and she prepares traditional foods, and she knows our feast system. She knows traditional parenting. And when I look at her, she embodies all that I want to be in terms of that knowledge, and she looks at me as the education one with my master's degree and my university education. And I tell her that she's my hero, and I really admire her because that's what I aspire to be. And I think that when I look at how that exists in the wider society, we have varying degrees of knowledge of our cultures depending on our experiences. We have my sons, for example, they have never grown up on reserve ever, whereas I did, right? And so my knowledge of my culture is different from theirs in terms of what I've been able to share with them, living away from home in my community, right? And so I think that, when it comes to restoring our culture, I think that it depends on us as individuals in terms of our commitment to do that work. I think we have to want to be able to do that, and it will be hard. It won't be easy. When I think about the complexity of that, because I think about our families and some of the difficult circumstances with which our families live. But I think you can also take a look at it from a positive approach as well too, and take a look at the strength that we have in family and the strength that we have in our cultures and our teachings, and really embrace that in the journey and grow with that, because I think that's what it's going to take to make the change happen.
Definitely. I want to be very clear that when we're talking about these sort of processes, it's not about laying blame at anyone's feet.
Exactly.
Everyone is where they are for a reason. And I can't even begin to understand or even guess at each person's journey, and I wouldn't want to. But I think all of us being aware that work needs to be done, that's the first step. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
And then however you engage with that is the way that you do, right?
Exactly. One thing that I learned, in my journey with the Ninoxala when I was doing my research with my master's degree was that that intentionality that I was talking about earlier in terms of the role of the women and their responsibility for the cultural continuity piece. And so I reflected on that within my own family, within my own 4 sons that I have. And so now what I've started to do is have those conversations at the dinner table with my boys and saying, guys, you know what, we don't know our culture because of our history, but that doesn't prevent us from learning about it now. And I spent time with the late Chief Frank Nelson, who I invited for dinner, and he said, I didn't learn my culture until I was in my 40s, Marcia. And he was so culturally strong, and he sang songs and he composed songs, and he was highly respected in the nation. And I would never have believed that he never learned until he was in his later years in his life. And then when I sat down with Elder Vera Newman, she talked about, I invited her to my home with Edwin, and Vera said, you know what, Marcia, we grew up in a time when the potlatch was being banned. And so we weren't allowed, to practice our songs and ceremony and dance. In fact, she said, we were being taught, to try to be white, she was saying. Yeah. And so I had to learn my language and culture later on in life. And so when I reflect on what they shared and the vulnerability they shared in terms of their learning journey and their lived experiences around the impact of colonization in their lives, I realize how authentic they were. I realize how that is so important, for us to move forward. And so I have those conversations with my boys at the dinner table and saying, okay, let's talk about what we know and what we don't know. And let's begin there.
Great. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. As a youth, what are some of the ways for us to reclaim Indigenous leadership roles, or for them to engage in the system, I suppose?
I think if I can reflect on my boys, I think connecting with your families, I think is important, because I think when I talked about that at the beginning of the session, I think that a lot of our identity is tied to our family. And I know that is a starting place, because knowing who you are and knowing where you come from is really important teaching amongst our people. And unpacking that is huge. I mean, that's something that even at my age, I'm still unpacking and learning and understanding my own identity, my value systems, and how I learned that from my family. And spending time with the elders and spending time with the old people is another way of learning more about leadership in Indigenous contexts. And you can do that through some of the friendship centers. You can do that if you live in community. You can spend time with the elders in your community. I remember as a little girl, and I don't know why I did this, I just did, but I used to always go to this elder's house in my community. His name was Gideon. He had a biblical name, the late Gideon. He never spoke English. And so I remember being too little to be on his chair, and I would just get up on this little chair and sit there, and he would speak our language the whole time I visit him, and his wife would serve me fresh baked bread and tea. And I feel like the way in which we acquire our knowledge is from the old people, from our elders, and making that time to spend with those who have cultural knowledge is important. I think that's really key to bringing back that knowledge for our young people.
Almost similar to, words of advice for communities as well, to reconnect with your culture, reconnect with those knowledge systems, and stay strong and rooted in that.
Exactly.
The rest of it will come organically.
Exactly. And, that's the point that I was wanting to make earlier too, was I think in community, it happens organically. It happens differently. So for example, like if I go home to my community in Gitxsan, right, my sister will be there, and she'll be cutting moose at the table and preserving it, or she'll be preparing fish. And so or I remember when we went out and we used to do berry picking, that was a way of life for us. And so learning and acquiring knowledge happened organically. It happened as a way of life, right? And so it was not necessarily something that was spelled out like you would have in a classroom or in a program or a service. It was really just how we lived our life and how we embodied those ways of knowing, being, and doing as Indigenous people.
Wonderful. So I think this next question coming from Chaz again kind of leads into a little bit of what we're talking about, or it's an extension of what you just said. And how do you do this work in the urban context and within an urban Indigenous and within the urban Indigenous context? And I think one of the thoughts that question stirs in me is, typically within our urban, or not typically, but a lot of the times within urban Indigenous populations, it's not necessarily that those individuals are connected to one specific culture or nation, or they have been displaced and maybe don't have access to the land.
Yeah.
That our more rural communities can and do. What are your thoughts on that?
I think how I approach that, because I've been living away from home for about 35 years, right? Yeah. And so for me and my sons, and how I approach that was really more along the lines of aligning my value systems and my principles, in terms of how I bring culture into my family, into my life with the boys, right? And with my family. And so I can use the example of when I recognized, being in Lekwungen territory in Victoria, and it's not my territory, it's not, my land, not my culture or my people, but I'm Gitxsan. And so how do I be authentically me as a Gitxsan woman living in the Lekwungen territory? And so what I decided to do a few years ago was I used social media, and I put out a call for all Gitxsan people on the island. And I think we do this in different ways here in urban settings like Vancouver. There's Urban Gitxsan Society, where we gather, as Gitxsan people. There wasn't a formal group in Victoria, so I just put out a call, let's have a Gitxsan picnic. We managed to find a whole bunch of people. So, just really incorporating concepts of unity, concepts of the sense of belonging, and concepts of sense of identity, and incorporating that in a very organic way, such as a picnic, right? We didn't need a program or organization or funding to do it. Everybody just bring something, and let's meet at the beach, and let's get to know each other. And that sense of connection that we had as Gitxsan people was so much fun. We didn't even know each other. Like, it was just very interesting in terms of who we were and where we, our stories, our histories, in terms of our experiences, how we came to the island, what happened. Some of our Gitxsan folks that responded, that came to the picnic, talked about how they had attended the residential school and never returned home. Some talked about how they were part of the 60s scoop, and some came for school. So I think just really embracing some of the concepts and translating that into different approaches will help. And as I mentioned earlier, like for me, just finding ways to make those connections with other Indigenous people in Victoria. There's of course, there's the friendship centers there where they do have more formalized programs and services around creating that connection. But for me, a lot of what I do is I had recognized, I guess, as a spin-off from the Gitxsan picnic, was that one thing that I watched as a young girl was how the women in our communities would care for everyone in the village, right? And so there were no social services when I was growing up. That'll tell you my age. And so a lot of the programs and services that exist now didn't exist back then when I was growing up. And so I saw, the women's groups, rally together to take care of all the children in the community. And so those concepts of, care, concern, and compassion were role modeled to me by our women in our community. And so how do we do that in an urban context? So I started what I call a movement. It's not a program, it's not a committee, but I started the 100 Indigenous Aunties. And so I tried to find something catchy. And I brought women together in Victoria, and so I said, you know what, if we lived in a village, this would be role model to us, but we live in an urban city of Victoria. So how do we role model that to our children? How do we pass on that knowledge that was passed on to us by our grannies in community, and how do we role model concepts of care and concern and compassion? And so we created 100 Indigenous Aunties, and so we gather around the kitchen table, we keep it organic, we talk about the kind of things that we want to do as Indigenous women. And we chose aunties because we felt like the term aunties really reflected the roles of aunties in our families, because when our moms were busy, our aunties stepped in, right? So the whole concept of how we cared for one another, that responsibility was across everyone in the family. It wasn't just the responsibility of parents. So that kind of concept that we discussed as women. And so we also felt that gathering around the kitchen table and keeping it organic, because that's what the women did, that's what the aunties did in the village. And so just incorporating those kinds of concepts in an urban context is what we aim to do. And so now the 100 Indigenous Aunties has grown We
Is it
see
150 now?
we see more groups across the island.
Great.
People are hearing about it, and so women are gathering in other communities, and they're gathering in other provinces because they've heard about this work. And so I think it's really about finding ways to do that in a unique way in an urban context.
It's challenging.
It is.
Yeah,
it is, but possible.
But possible. So we're into our last couple minutes here. Time has just kind of flown by.
I know.
So I'm going to do my normal Learning Circle plug. If you have any last minute questions or comments for Marcia, please populate the chat box and we'll make sure to get back around to them. The Learning Circle moving forward, we only have a few more sessions left before we break for winter. On Thursday, we're going to welcome Elder Larry Grant's going to come and talk to us about language revitalization. Into December, then we're going to have Denise from Squamish come and chat with us about the science of attachment, care, and emotion. And then December 12th, we're going to finish with a conversation on sexual well-being. That'll be kind of groups from Youth Co, FNHA, BCCDC. A whole bunch of people are going to come and chat about kind of how we can all be healthier in a sexual way, I suppose. So I'll give you a last couple minutes here to populate. Okay, Jennifer says, for those of us working in colonial institutions as urban Indigenous people, or as urban natives, she says, what are ways we can be leaders in these organizations to bring forward Indigenous experiences and needs into these spaces, even when it is not in our work roles? So I think, yeah, so if you're not in a leadership role, but you want to bring to the table these Indigenous models and Indigenous experiences, how can you kind of go about doing that within an institution? Or
I think
it's a great question, Jen.
Yeah, it is a good question. That's the question of the day. The question of the century. How do we do that? I think if there were easy answers for that, I think we would have known how to do that by now. But I'll let you know some of the ways in which I try to do that as a leader in past organizations. And I think that for me, a lot of the leadership values that I bring, I reflect on that in terms of who I am. And we, I actually never even thought of myself as a leader until more recently. And then I just felt like I'm just Marcia, and so and I just was passionate about what I was doing, and so I think that if you bring values that are in alignment with ancestral teachings into the workplace, I think that's one way in which you can work to support how that shows up in the work that you do with your staff and your coworkers and your clients. And I was working with one community as an administrator, and what I tried to do was support some of those concepts that are aligned with our Indigenous values in terms of empowering the staff. When I reflect on Elder and Chief Edwin Newman, how he talked about how we need to lift each other up, and so how do we do that in an organizational context, right? And so that to me is empowering the staff. That's supporting their aspirations and supporting their goals and supporting their work and making time for them and making time for one another. As an administrator, I worked because there were so many demands on my time and so much coming at me. I really worked to ensure that I made time for everyone that I supervised. And so I mapped out half an hour for every staff member weekly, and so they had that dedicated time with me. So just really being intentional, that intentionality that I was talking about earlier in terms of what we do in terms of our leadership roles, that kind of approach. And I recall if you do have opportunity where you can learn some of the teachings and apply those to your organizational systems, then and draw those parallels where you can, right? And I'll use the example of one community where I was the band administrator, and you talked about the colonial system of chief and council, and so we often see in communities where some of the councils still are really interfering with the band administration, and so the strength of the governance system is not quite there. And so when I was a band manager, I met with my chief and council, and I drew parallels between their Kwakwaka'wakw governance system and the chief and council system to demonstrate what Western society refers to as good governance, right? And so I talked about how in a potlatch system, you have the chiefs all meet over here, right? They before you step into the potlatch into the Gitxsan, they will meet as leaders to talk about the business that's going to be conducted in the pasa and the potlatch. And then so when we're in the potlatch, we're in the big house, we're sitting there, and you see the drummers are here and they're at the log, and then you see the chiefs are sitting in front of the log, and you'll see the host chief sitting there in the chair, and you'll see the speaker, and then you'll see the community members, and then the ceremonial floor and the fire. And so I walk them through how to draw parallels in terms of good governance. That system of governance that we see in the Gitxsan, in the potlatch, was the strength of the Kwakwaka'wakw people. That was what sustained the people in terms of governance and leadership, and those principles that are practiced within the potlatch. So how do we apply that to a chief and council system? So I talked to them about how as chief and council, it's not your job to come into the band administration office and start managing the staff. You never see a chief jump on the log. The staff are the people at the log are my staff. Right, and so and the speaker in the Gitxsan, that's me. The speaker is your band manager, and you never see the chief jump on the log ever in a potlatch, and you never see you. When a chief does speak in the potlatch, they speak to welcome everybody, and they speak for specific reasons. But they have a speaker that leads the business that's being conducted in the potlatch. So I drew parallels from my role as band manager to the speaker. I drew parallels from the people on the log to my staff, and where we draw that line for good governance, right? And so if there's opportunity to explore those teachings within your own culture, I would look to doing that and finding ways you can draw those parallels.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you gotta trust the people at the log, right?
Yeah,
that they're gonna do what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
So last minute, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions for today. If you have anything, any follow-up questions, I'm sure we can talk about maybe some correspondence for individuals later on. But we are officially out of time today.
Thank you.
So yeah, big thank you to everyone that sat in circle with us today, contributed your questions and your comments. I really appreciate it. It really helps to stimulate our conversation and allow us to dive deeper into these concepts. So again, thank you, Marcia, Gitxsan, for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the session with you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.